Thank you very much. Over the next several days, we will be addressing many of the current and future issues concerning counterterrorism. I'd like to begin by taking a step back and reviewing the trajectory of terrorism and evolving efforts to combat it over the previous years. And let me start with a question. What are the most significant developments in the nature of armed conflict over the past 40 years? Certainly one would include the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. It reduced the threat of nuclear war and it allowed a reduction in the vast nuclear arsenals possessed by both superpowers. Paradoxically, however, the threat that nuclear weapons may be used by regional powers or even by non-state actors has increased. Some might instead point to the current events in the Middle East, which are changing the political landscape and could lead to a broader regional conflict. Some would point to developments in military technology, the perfection of precision-guided munitions, the development of unmanned aircraft, and the probable increasing use of robotics on the battlefield. Still others would point to the emerging threat of war in cyberspace, an entirely new dimension of conflict. To these I would add one, that is the transformation of terrorism from being addressed as an issue of diplomacy and international law to becoming a global war. Now, I recognize that the term war is itself controversial. Not all nations would frame their counter-terrorist efforts as war, and we in the United States have abandoned the term. But here it implies not merely the use of military force, but a broadening of the spectrum of responses employed against terrorists to include military action. Certainly terrorism is widely seen today as a global threat. It involves a large portion of the planet as a battlefield. Many nations have committed their armies to military operations in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and North Africa, as well as to efforts to assist fragile states and eliminate ungoverned spaces where terrorism breeds. Whatever we call it, that war goes on and seems likely to remain the most salient mission, at least of the U.S. Armed Forces, for the foreseeable future. How did this come about? When terrorism in its contemporary form emerged in the late 1960s, it was generally not perceived as a mode of armed conflict. Terrorists at that time had a limited tactical repertoire and an even more limited sense of strategy. What made their activities a matter of international concern was the fact that their violence spilled over into the international domain by hijacking airliners, by targeting foreign nationals, kidnapping diplomats, for example, or by going abroad to carry out their attacks. When the U.S. was a target of these events, it did not directly attack the terrorist groups, but instead took an approach of trying to prevent local conflicts from spilling over into the international arena by outlawing terrorist tactics themselves. The American approach was to build international consensus to make terrorism a criminal activity, a violation of the rules of war, regardless of political cause. The U.S. State Department, not the Department of Defense, took the lead. The challenge, of course, in doing so was that the international community could not agree on a definition of terrorism. It still cannot. But it could agree on outlawing certain targets and certain tactics. The result was a corpus of 13 international conventions that criminalized much of what terrorists did. It took 30 years to get there. Meanwhile, terrorists continued to take hostages, hijacking airliners, kidnapping diplomats, seizing embassies. Increasingly unwilling to yield to terrorist demands, nations began to develop rescue capabilities, armed rescue capabilities. And of course, in 1976, Israeli commandos, in a daring operation, rescued passengers held at Entebbe. The following year, German commandos rescued passengers held aboard a hijacked airliner in Mogadishu. Following these examples, the United States created Delta Force, giving it an armed rescue option. This was first used in 1980 as part of an elaborate plan to rescue American diplomats held in Tehran. The attempt failed, but hostage rescue remained a military mission. This was the first step. The military mission expanded again after the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983. We had briefly contemplated military action in retaliation for this attack as part of a joint operation with the French, but pulled out at the last moment. Reflecting its bitter experience in Vietnam, the American military was unenthusiastic about becoming more involved in Lebanon's civil war. One senses some parallels here in the military's attitudes toward involvement in Syria's civil war. However, the Pentagon Commission that had been created to review the bombing concluded that terrorist warfare, they use the term terrorist warfare, can have significant political effects, and in fact, the attack demonstrated that the United States Department of Defense is inadequately prepared to deal with the terrorist threat. That, combined with Secretary of State Shultz's arguments that the declared unwillingness to use force undercut U.S. diplomacy. The result of the debate was a 1984 National Security Directive that instructed the Secretary of Defense to develop a full range of military options to combat terrorism. Military force in response to terrorism was first employed in 1986 when the United States bombed Libya in response to its role in a terrorist attack in Berlin that resulted in the death of U.S. soldiers. There were subsequent military strikes in Iraq in 1993, in Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998. And in fact, that last strike was the first time that the United States directly targeted a terrorist group. In fact, in the 1990s, the United States focus continued to shift from outlawing terrorist tactics to directly attacking terrorist groups. The shift was completed following the 9/11 attacks when the president declared war on terror, actually meaning war on al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The key element in this declaration was that the United States would not simply carry out another one-off attack in response to terrorism, but this time the United States would initiate a continuing campaign aimed at the destruction of the terrorist group. The war on terror did not replace the continuing U.S. campaign to outlaw the use of terrorist tactics, although the two were sometimes confused. But the war on terror, which continues, completed the shift in focus from combating terrorist tactics to destroying terrorist groups. This shift coincides with some fundamental changes in the nature of armed conflict itself. Let me highlight several of them. Most conflicts today are internal. Civil wars, guerrilla contests, terrorist campaigns, these are typically long and nasty. Counterinsurgency, that least preferred of all military missions, continues to demand attention. Second, armed non-state actors are acquiring a growing capacity for destruction, for disruption, and the creation of fear, possibly even in the future acquiring unconventional weapons. Third, the distinction between frontline and the home front is completely dissolving, as terrorists are able to deliver violence to home fronts with rockets, missiles, terrorist commando raids across the globe, or by recruiting homegrown operatives. Homeland security commands increasing resources as a result. Fourth, non-state belligerents seeking independent sources of financing are increasingly involved in criminal activities and in some cases creating nexuses with transnational crime organizations. At the same time, powerful criminal organizations are increasingly willing to directly challenge state authority with the use of terrorist tactics. And fifth, states are increasingly constrained in their ability to respond militarily. Modern industrialized societies are increasingly reluctant to go to war. This is not a consequence of the traditional philosophy of pacifism, but the result of a narrower cost-benefit calculation. Military budgets are declining, large standing armies are shrinking, armies are increasingly composed of small numbers of professional soldiers. As a result of this, civilian populations are increasingly disengaged from war and from their own military institutions. And that makes it increasingly difficult to mobilize or to sustain support for military efforts. There is also an increasing unwillingness, especially in the West, to accept or to inflict casualties. The opposite, of course, is true of terrorists who are increasing their determination to kill in quantity. The net result of this unwillingness to divert resources, constraints on the use of weapons, and reluctance to accept or inflict casualties, warfare is increasingly a matter of manipulating perceptions. This is an area where terrorists excel. So where does this take us into the future? President Obama has said that this war, the war on terror, like all wars, must end. But we cannot easily extricate ourselves from current counter-terrorist efforts. Instead, we seem to be moving into a perpetual state of war, although we don't like the costs and we are uncertain of its implications for democracy. The shift in focus and the growing military role does not reflect a master strategy, but actually is an accumulation of responses to specific events, although in some cases these responses were accompanied by intense policy debate. This suggests that future responses will be shaped by future events. For example, restrictive rules of engagement and other constraints could change rapidly if the terrorist threat were to escalate, or if terrorists were to use unconventional weapons. To be sure, a theoretical post-nuclear terrorist world would not operate with the same rules that a pre-terrorist nuclear world operates in. The unconventional nature of counterterrorism missions has resulted in an increasingly dominant role played by special operations forces. This has implications. While conventional military planners still see war as a finite undertaking, those involved in special operations tend to see warfare as perpetual, and it often is for them. Special operations commands themselves are increasingly dominated by those engaged in kinetic missions, door kickers, not the older tradition of long-term engagement with indigenous, often irregular forces. One can envision a future here, shaping conflict in which there will be a running global battles between terrorists armed with conventional and unconventional weapons and increasingly specialized professional counter-terrorist forces, a war that continues for decades, as seems likely. Thank you very much.